Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3. We're so happy to see you again and that you are here to complete our 3-day journey together. Whilst more attendees are joining, would you be so kind to look at the question we've got on the slide there for you today? What is your burning security question? Today, of course, is a focus on cybersecurity, and with my colleagues Roscoe, Genevieve, in the session taking a lot of the content on today, we were hoping you can share any burning security question that you have just with us in the chat up front or in the Q&A, and we can answer it as we go. Of course, Roscoe has started his journey with a white hat or ethical hacker background or experience. So you've got somebody here who has frontline cybersecurity experience in the room with us today. So if you have a question that you have always had on your mind, or maybe before today you were wondering, please do share that in the chat so long. I will start looking out for chat contributions. Thanks as well for all the activity in the Q&A. I hope you feel like as the questions are raised, they're answered effectively by the panelists, that we hear you, that we get to the questions timeously. So please do continue that today as we proceed. Okay, I see we have 14 attendees. I'll get going in a minute. And again, any burning security questions, please share with us and then we get going. As you share with us, I'll start with the introductions, of course, and the overview. So from today's side, we will complete this framework with a focus on IT assurance and reporting. Vilmarie and Priyanka will be taking care of that for us, and we'll be the main panelists speaking to these topics. And then later on, we will be getting to the Joint Standard 2 and a lot of the practical cybersecurity requirements. Some questions have come up to that effect yesterday. So we'll try and answer those as well as we go along. I'm already seeing a great question popping up in the Q&A about artificial intelligence and security. Great start. Thank you for that. So do keep them coming in. We've been receiving a lot of positive feedback about this table, about this approach that we've taken, and we're really glad to hear that it's been landing well and that it's practical and positive for you. And today will be no different. So we'll continue within that framework. From an IT assurance perspective, we're going to get going and we're going to jump in. So we've got quite a lot to cover today, and thought it well to just take a moment here as I invite Priyanka to share a little bit more about what this entails. I think, Priyanka, last time we chatted and in yesterday's poll or Q&A, there were questions about the independent reviewing as well from an IT service provider perspective. So I'm hoping we can address that today as we go.
Yes.
What stands out for you here as we consider the language in front of us?
For me, it's good morning, everybody. Hope you are well this morning, and thanks for staying with us on this sort of 3-day journey that we're taking you through. For IT assurance, I think it's very interesting, Francois, that there's a lot of emphasis on independence. And what does it mean to have an independent IT assurance? It's not necessarily that you have to have a third party coming in and doing your sort of audit for you to check that everything in your compliance is nice and clean. It can also be a function that's done internally. But what the standard requires is that independence is still the objective and still the outcome of whatever assurance activities are done. So I think where we are looking at an internal function, we've got to see how do we actually still achieve independence so you're not effectively marking your own homework. It's pointless saying, "Yep, we're compliant. We have done we've ticked all our boxes, and we're good and clean, and that's enough, and we're therefore compliant with this requirement." What will actually be assessed is whether the way in which you did your assurance was sufficiently independent. And I'll give some tips in a sec.
Thank you. What comes to mind if I think of this narrative?
Oh, sorry, Francois. I don't know if it's me, but your audio is a bit soft.
Let's check again. All right.
Yes, that's brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you. It's if we consider the house narrative, it's almost similar to inviting someone to come and do a COC on
Yeah,
your electrical installation or your gas. And it's not something that just stays static. You need to keep checking these things. And now more, I suppose, recently, people are installing or retrofitting new systems into their homes, like solar panels and whatnot. And all of that requires some level of an independent check. I suppose depending on what organization you are and where you are viewing this from, it will look different for you. Just going into the LPPT table, does it look different for outsourcing? Priyanka, say we have smaller organizations and they outsource a lot more. Does that look different for them than, say, bigger organizations that have more capabilities in-sourced, or is there actually no significant difference between the two? I think that's just something that's come up over the last couple of days that I thought would be worth
yeah.
touching on as we continue.
No, it's a good question, and I think we do find a lot of FIs do tend to outsource a lot of their operations, but ultimately, whether you're outsourcing or you're managing everything internally or most things internally, you still remain accountable. So I think sometimes your risk can be seen as increasing if you're engaging a lot of third parties to help you with your operations, but that's not unusual. We do see it a lot. It's definitely not unusual. It's not a risk that is difficult to manage. You look at having, your contracts and stuff in place. So the same way you would do your own assurance, you also need to do your assurance on your third parties. That's what it really comes down to as well. So for me, what jumps out with the section in the joints, and as I mentioned, is it does look at independence, and I think it's very interesting, especially for those FIs that have already quite a sophisticated or robust internal audit function or a dedicated audit team. How do you actually achieve that assurance? Because it has to be independent. And the idea is that yes, your internal audit team can still be doing the assurance. They obviously need to have the expertise to know how to do the assurance. Of course, IT is a very unique and specific type of subject matter. So you want to make sure that the people who are doing the assurance have that expertise and that they're not reporting to their boss, like their CIO. It needs to be a very independent function that ultimately signs off on that assurance. So, for example, the head of the audit committee or, chief risk officer, those kinds of roles. So that's quite important, I think, when you're using an internal IT audit function or an IT risk function. How do you really just practically navigate and make sure that you're truly achieving independence? Perhaps it might be easier if you're using an external assurance provider. I know, Franco, you guys do a lot of that for your clients, but that often is a better or easier way to just make sure, okay, yes, we're definitely independent. We don't have to really interrogate that. But sometimes it is a factor to consider as well, to make sure that your external audit or your external assurance firm is actually conducting those independent reviews, and they have usually that expertise to come in looking at system security, your DR testing, your even your vendors that you're using. Because of course you don't want to be using a current vendor in your environment to also do your assurance, then that's gonna kind of diminish the requirement of independence. So you definitely need to be bringing in someone who is totally independent to make sure that they are able to actually mark your homework and give you the right scoring. So it is very important to think about it that way, really just looking at independence as the key objective of this criteria. Sorry, Franca, I can't hear you.
Not sure what's wrong with my sound
This is
today.
good.
Sorry. I see we've got a question in the Q&A that popped up, and I'm hoping maybe you're comfortable answering it live for us. The question was, how do we verify the competence of an independent verifier? Are there certification agencies that certify competence of security experts? And I'm also happy for you to delegate, of course, to other panelists. But I thought it's such a timely question for where we are now. Yes.
Yeah, and I think thanks, John, for the question. So to verify the independence is assessed in relation to you as the company. So they need to be independent of your financial institution when they're coming in and doing the assessment and assurance. What you really need to be looking for is their competence and their expertise. And for that, you need to really be interrogating their skills and how they position themselves in the way you would go to a lawyer like myself, and you want to make sure that you're dealing with someone who's actually has the qualifications to advise you in IT law, privacy law. You'd want to look at my qualifications. You'd want to look at the kind of clients I've advised in the past, the kind of projects I've been involved in. So very similarly, when you reach out to a third party, you would be able to actually interrogate that. Like, tell us more. What is your experience with doing IT assurance for clients, and the like? You're not necessarily going to find a number of there's no such really thing as a certified IT assurance provider. It will be, looking at skills and expertise that you're looking at. But I think perhaps I can defer to Roscoe, Jen, because I know you guys do actually do this kind of work. Maybe if you can give an idea of what that would look like when you're working on it. Oh, Francois, you said you'd like to also answer the question live. Okay, great. Francois, your audio today is not great.
I'll try and see if I can make changes. But
This
Roscoe,
is good.
Jen, do you have anything to add there in terms of what Priyanka is saying from credentials and what does one look out for to independently verify the external party's ability to do the job? Looking
Yeah,
forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
yeah, 100%. So from a certification point of view, there are certifications such as your CISA, which stands for Certified Information Systems Auditor. Um, and those are the certifications which are essentially governed by a body of knowledge called ISACA, which is quite well respected in the industry, as essentially certifying those skills. Another one of the certifications is a CISM, which is the Certified Information Systems Manager. Yeah, having those types of certifications really put a independent stamp on that again to say this person is certified. They went through the necessary training material, they validated the skills by taking a rigorous exam and passed it. So when you want to engage with with an organization that's going to do this assessment for you, you can ask them for their team members certifications, and that might just be able to give you a bit more confidence in validating their skills.
I
Genevieve, is there
appreciate that.
anything else you would
I,
like to
appre-
add? Sorry, thanks
I
for
appreciate that, Roscoe. That's really insightful. Could you be so kind just to, in the public chat, just note those two acronyms that you shared. I think that could be quite useful just with the question that's popped up to the benefit of all attending.
Yeah,
So I'm going to
sure.
mark that one done as
Will do.
answered.
It's
Thank
just a
you.
correction. The CISM is a certified information security manager. So not information systems manager, but security. I will pop them in the chat and the governing body as well.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Apologies for my audio today. I'm trying to see what I can do without having to leave the session, so just bear with me. I see another question has popped up in the Q&A as well. And Priyanka, you indicated you'd like to take that one now as well. Just for the benefit of the room, the question is around IT assurance or monitoring. And is there compliance with regulatory requirements and the correct function to take care of that? Some people may or may not have IT backgrounds or insights. What kind of qualifications or knowledge do they need to get or to ensure that they are able to assist with the compliance we're talking about today? Priyanka, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So thanks, Anonymous, for the question. It really does depend on whether the person will actually have that expertise to make that assessment. Sometimes, your compliance function within the FI might not have that knowledge. So, for example, I'm a lawyer. I only have there's only so far my expertise as a lawyer can take me, and that's why we're coupled up with our colleagues from Cyberlogic today, because there's this technical gap that I lack. That's where they come in. So you're looking for really, because the standard does require a very technical, heavy assurance that's needed. If your compliance function actually has that expertise, great, then that's fine. As long as they are able to look at a system and say, yes, the system has, for example, adequate disaster recovery measures in place, or they can look at a particular piece of software and they are actually able to make that assessment. Compliance can also work together with the sort of risk or audit function if any kind of input is needed or interpretation of legal requirements. But I do think it definitely needs to be someone who does have that expertise and qualification. And how do you get that? It is really just looking at you have the right backgrounds. I think also what Roscoe mentioned as well in terms of qualifications or certifications as well. Having that expertise is quite important, just to make sure that you have the informed knowledge, the same way I would have my LLB or my LLM to actually come and be able to make informed, and give clients informed advice. That's what's needed. And again, really just looking at independence. So as you mentioned, that could be managed internally, or you're looking at your external providers.
Thank you so much for the great questions so far on these topics. That's great. And there's clearly a need. So I would encourage you, following the webinar, we're going to reach out to you, of course, with the material, the templates. So if you have questions in terms of who can help with a certain piece of reviewing or independence, we'd be happy to take a conversation further. I appreciate that some of you might not want to raise this publicly in the webinar format, so do feel free to reach out.
I also wanted to say, Francois, sorry for interrupting you, but what I've also seen work with some clients is a bit of a blend of the two. So I've seen some clients with their boards or their if they have trustees or anything like that, the audit committee will actually be the one to manage the outsource to a third party. So they would actually be the function internally, still within the audit team internally, but they are actually the ones engaging the likes of a Cyberlogic or any of your other competitors, Francois, to actually do the assurance, and they work together quite closely, because that person will require a lot of information, documentation, and the like to inform their assurance reporting. So that's what's needed.
I think the process of collaboration is becoming more and more apparent, Priyanka, today, where we're seeing people are definitely playing to their strengths more and more. I know the sector quite well on our side, and so increasingly, I cross paths with people in the industry who would be doing the review or who will be the service provider, and we're doing the review. So I think that's also nice to mention. There's definitely an openness towards that, and I'm seeing positive dynamics for the accountable institutions. You know, when people come together like this. If you're comfortable, I'm going to move to the reporting piece,
Yes, thank you,
and
Frank.
Vilmarie will be guiding us through this particular component this morning. And hello, Vilmarie. The
Morning,
language here is
Francois.
quite it's quite straightforward and to the point, which I don't believe is necessarily something we need to unpack per se. Uh, if you're comfortable, we can jump straight into the house narrative. And the narrative we have here is the premise of notifying as soon as something does happen. I think of short-term insurance. If your geyser goes or something has happened, you have a window in which to report that to your insurer. And Vilmarie, I think especially since the Poppy days, there's been so much happening in terms of reporting when, what to do. I think the
Absolutely.
IOs and the IOs and the DIOs in the room are quite curious, I suppose, to hear what sort of reporting requirements do we have and what overlaps a little bit. So I'm keen to hear from you. I hope also for everybody in the room, this table makes things simple, as always. So Vilmarie, over to you.
Thanks, Francois, and morning, everyone. So what we did in this table in terms of reporting, because there's so many different pieces of legislation that's now requiring reporting, we've kind of list all the reporting obligations under your joint standards, under the Cybercrimes Act, and under POPI or GDPR or whatever data privacy laws are applicable to your organization on top of that. I'm not going to go in detail through the whole list because you'll get the slide and there's a whole list of what needs to be reported to the various authorities. But what is interesting is the distinction or the various obligations to report security incidents or a security breach. Now, we are all quite familiar with the requirements under POPI that any security incident or security compromise, as it's called there, must be reported to the information regulator. Definitely from our team, we've seen a massive increase in the reporting of security incidents. Unfortunately, under POPI, there is no materiality requirement. So whether it is the smallest incident or a really big incident, there's this obligation to notify the regulator, and there's forms that have to be filled out and notify data subjects. And I think that is one of the reasons why the information regulator are so inundated with security breach notifications, because the smallest things are being reported just to ensure that we remain compliant, because the consequences of non-reporting is so grave that we rather err on the side of caution. What is interesting is under the reporting obligations under Joint Standard 2 specifically say that it is for a material incident. So at least that makes it, it narrows it down a little bit in terms of your reporting obligation of security incidents to your authority. But it is important to remember, if you are a financial institution, that you have to report these security incidents not only to the information regulator, but if it is a material incident, you also have to report it to your governing authority. So I think that was that's a bit of an overlap between the two. I think the one being a little bit more clear as to when we have to report and when we don't have to report. Obviously, if you are banks, there are further obligations on you to also report material IT and security incidents under the SARB directives. Under the Cybercrimes Act, there's a very specific mention of financial institutions and their obligation to report any kind of suspicion that there is fraudulent activities or crime being committed on their systems. That section has not yet come into force. We're waiting to see when that is into force, but we mention it because it's something to continue to look out. Then there's other obligations on insurers, for instance, to notify their authority of material outsourcing arrangements. So we've listed all of the reporting obligations. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, other than to say what is important in terms of our to-do list is to have a proper incident management plan. And part of that, and we spoke about that before, is having a proper decision tree so that you understand when an incident happened, do I have to report, do I not have to report? And what is the process I need to follow? And have proper templates handy. Have your reporting templates, your templates for how do we deal with this? Because things normally happen very quickly. We get these calls when there was an incident, and it's normally chaos. What do we do? How do we report? Who do we report? How do we control media? So to have processes in place and to have your templates ready so that you know how to respond to an incident, it really helps with dealing with that incident when it actually occurs, because like I say, it's normally a scramble to deal with those kind of incidents. So just having your processes in place is a big help. Francha, I think that brings us to the end of Joint Standards 1. It's been quite a lot of information over the last 2 days, but I think if we look at all our little bubbles we created in the beginning, we've now kind of checked all of them. And so now a good time for us to move on to the Joint Standards 2 and all the security requirements under that, which I think will be another mouthful today.
Thank you, Vilmarie. And yes, I also thought as we move into more of the security realm, if you have cyber insurance, there's also that additional process step to consider and align with your processes.
Absolutely.
As you say, Vilmarie, it's such a scramble. We see this all the time. And okay, now there's with the regulator and the insurer and which parties are involved. Definitely something to iron out, and I'm saying this openly to the larger institutions as well. It's nice to have this documented, but when it actually comes to it, certainly on our side, we're seeing a lot of uncertainty sometimes when these risk events do trigger. So it's a good one to take us into the security focused Joint Standard 2. At this point, I thought it's very good to highlight in the Q&A. There was a message sent to the panelists and the hosts. What is our view on the payment of ransom where security has been compromised and the third party demands a ransom? So that is a very good question. I see it as part of the burning security questions that came up earlier. So thank you for raising that. Let's see as we go from here if we can attend to that. And certainly something that's very topical, because I know certain federal governments around the world are starting to reconsider that as well. So definitely something to look at. As I go over to the Joint Standard 2, it's worth mentioning that my colleagues Roscoe and Genevieve are going to be facilitating and hosting this a bit more actively. So I'm going to invite Genevieve to take over from me. You know, the burning question now for me is, what are the key differences between Joint Standard 1 and 2? I suppose that's a question that most attendees would have had since they joined, Genevieve. So if you can highlight that for us, and I'll keep a watch on the poll or the Q&A, the chat, and just signal where, as you go, we could possibly take a quick pause moment for questions. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks, Francois, and good morning, everyone. So the key differences between the Joint Standard 1 and 2 is mainly that the Joint Standard 1 covers the IT governance and the IT risk management framework. So it's a bit broader. And the emphasis is on establishing robust IT strategies, risk management, and ensuring the oversight of the IT operations. Whereas Joint Standard 2 is focused or dedicated to cybersecurity and cyber resilience, and it addresses the requirements for protecting IT systems and information assets from cyber threats to ensure that institutions have the ability to respond and to recover from cyber incidents. So that is the key difference. It's focused on cyber threats and how you can respond to that. In addition to that, there is a difference in terms of the additional entities that are included in the Joint Standard 2, sorry. And the additional entities are the pension funds and the administrators, the OTC derivative providers, the registered credit rating agencies, and the Category 1 FSPs. So it's reflecting a broader scope in the context of cybersecurity and cyber resilience. And yeah, that's the basic, the two key difference in terms of that. Going into the standard itself, they also give definitions. Sorry, I'm just trying to. Yeah, so there's definitions that they provide. There's a long list of it. I've just, basically took out a few of it because people would like to know, what does cyber mean? And really, cyber is anything that happens through computers and the internet. It's not going to relate to information outside of that. So if it's in paper format, it's not going to, the Joint Standard doesn't address that. So that's the main thing in terms of cyber and cybersecurity. It's the preservation of the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of information in IT systems as the cyber medium. If there's any questions on the definitions or there's any clarity needed, you can always pop that in the chat now if you'd like. But I'll go to the next section then. Cool. So then there are 9 aspects that we are going to cover today for the Joint Standard 2. The first one is governance and responsibility. And this is basically looking at, the governing body must take responsibility for managing cyber risk and developing strong cybersecurity strategies, assigning clear roles, and embedding these efforts into the overall governance and encouraging collaboration and independent oversight. If we tie this back to the analogy, the house analogy, it's like a homeowner securing the house with a security plan. So like having locks on the doors, installing alarms, having an emergency plan if you need to keep your home safe. The governing body must ensure that there's a clear plan in place to protect the systems and the data from online threats. And this plan needs to be known by everyone to make sure that it's safe and can manage the risks. So looking at the LPP table, I'm not going to go through everything in detail, but what it's basically requiring the institutions to make sure that there's a governing body that must establish processes to ensure compliance with the standard and provide oversight of risk management. They can delegate this oversight to another committee if needed for primary oversight, but the governing body is essentially responsible for ensuring compliance. They also need to encourage collaboration between the different stakeholders. So, for example, the internal teams, the third parties, and the regulators. And then also clearly define the roles and responsibilities that make up the oversight and make sure that there's segregation of duties between the different teams and there's no conflict of interest. So like what Priyanka mentioned in the previous session in terms of IT independent assurance, you would want the same kind of report lines need to be to different governing bodies or committees, just to make sure that there is no conflicts of interest and that you're not marking your homework basically. So there needs to be that oversight. And then also you need to ensure that these third-party providers, there needs to be documented contracts and SLAs in place, because they also need to make sure that their systems are secure and that they abide with these security requirements that are in the standard and within the institution's framework. and their risk management framework as well. So the governing body also needs to set up dedicated functions to make sure that there is a cyber and information security responsibilities in place and that they have adequate resources for this. Another requirement is that the governing body needs to develop a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy, and that's basically including your objectives. What is the plan for the next 3 or 4, 5 years? Where do you see yourself in terms of your security goals? And then also, in terms of the strategy, create a cybersecurity framework in order to achieve those goals and make sure that you can manage the risk that's associated to the organization. The framework must be informed by industry standards and best practices, and it must be reviewed on an annual basis. Sure. And then also just in terms of cybersecurity risk management. So like we mentioned in the previous, the first day, there's an IT risk management. There also needs to be a cybersecurity risk management framework. And that needs to be integrated with your enterprise governance and your enterprise risk management framework. So there should be possibly one document that you include all of these different risks and include your cyber risk, include your IT risk, because they are different, but you need to have a integrated ERM in place for that. And then also just to ensure that there are regular risk assessments being performed and that you always assess the risk tolerances. I mean, you might pick up in a year or so that, your risk tolerances has changed and you might want to, put more measures in place in order to reduce the risk. And then also another requirement is to develop metrics so that you can monitor and manage these risks on a regular basis. And that should possibly be part of some sort of board reporting or dashboard where they can monitor this on a continuous basis to make sure that what's in place and the strategy that is in place is working for the organization. Cool. Then the next one that we're going to touch on, I'll just go back to the governance matrix. So I've just got an example here. So how to possibly put the roles and responsibilities in a format where you can see where there's segregation of duties, who does what, making sure that there's no conflicts of interest. So this is just an example of how you can put the matrix together and you can include that into your governance framework. So the next section that we're going to cover is the Joint Standard 2 lays out measures for institutions to implement in order to identify, protect, and detect and respond to cyber threats and these are broken up into these 5 different areas, which we are going to go into detail about. And these measures can be, implementing encryption, firewalls, but we'll go through all these measures in detail in the next few sections. The first one is identification. And this requirement requires you to identify and classify business process. Sorry, I think there's just a lag with the slides here.
Apologies.
No worries. So the first area is identification, and this requires that financial institutions identify and classify their business processes and the information assets. They need to understand what is important to them. Not everything's going to have the same classification. So you would want to make sure that you have an inventory of this, and you need to also include that the information that's managed by third parties. With this, once you've identified these business processes and information assets, then you can conduct security risk assessments to ensure that you classify it and incorporate security measures appropriate to the risk involved in that. So going into the house analogy, so think of it like in terms of cybersecurity, it's like knowing what is valuable in your home. Not everything is the same, right? You might have a painting that is not that valuable, and maybe a painting that is so valuable that you put it in a locked safe or something like that. So you need to understand what is important to you, and identify that, and then make sure that the most important parts of your digital operations, such as your critical data and your systems, get the proper protection against these threats. So the first one, in terms of the identification, is basically, like I mentioned, create an asset inventory of all your assets that you have in your organization. Put it in a spreadsheet or wherever you would want to put it, in some sort of tool. List it, make sure that there is an asset owner allocated to it, so that they are responsible for that asset. And then also assess it in terms of the criticality and the sensitivity. So if that information had to be leaked, what would the actual impact be to the organization? And the impact is financial. You possibly might get a penalty, or there's a reputational impact. There's several impacts that you need to consider in order to classify this asset. And based on that, you can then determine, what measures you need to put in place. And after that, you'll have this inventory, and you need to maintain this inventory and update it where necessary. If there's changes in the environment, you might not need this information anymore. So possibly, they say update it and review it every 2 years, but ideally you would want to do it more often than that. And so the to-do list for this is, develop classification criteria, and that's possibly something that you can incorporate into your risk management assessment or your methodology. Map all your processes out and information assets, and then maintain this asset register and keep it up to date. Then the next requirement is protection. Just going into the next slide. And this requires financial institutions to put in place strong, multi-layered cybersecurity measures across the areas. And this includes, implementing robust identity and access management, data protection and security, to name a few. And these measures are designed to prevent and protect the organization from cyber threats, in line with what you've done in the previous section, identification, where you've evaluated these risks. So in terms of the analogy, just as you secure your home by controlling who can enter and monitor visitors, protect your assets, meaning that you need to limit your access to critical data. Keep an eye and monitor incoming, outgoing connections, and ensuring that third parties can understand their roles and responsibilities. So going into the LPPT framework, protection has many areas that are going to be covered today. One is identity and access management. We will go into cybersecurity training and all that. So I'm going to cover the identity and access management first. And that is basically making sure the institutions restrict access to only authorized devices, users, processes. And this is something that you can do in terms of role-based access or least privileged access, and you can manage that through a identity and access management. If you don't have that, there's also, certain other types of ways you can do that. But you need to also establish the policies and procedures for this. So, once you establish these policies and procedures, then you could actually implement what are you required to do as per the policy. So also in terms of identity and access management, you should identify every asset that needs protection, as in the previous area, and then implement strong measures for that. And some of the measures are, implementing strong authentication mechanisms. They mention for remote users, but ideally you would want to implement strong authentication measures like multi-factor authentication for everyone in the organization, not just for remote users. That's best practice, but the standard only, asks for the remote users in this case. And then also ensuring that the remote access to information systems is permitted to only devices or connections that meet the security standards of the financial institution. Also, you need to review access regularly, including privileged users. So there are users within the organization that have admin rights. These users should be monitored very carefully. You shouldn't have, you shouldn't be using your admin rights for normal day-to-day work. There needs to be monitored and reviewed regularly together with users in general. So you should be performing regular user access reviews for all your employees, ideally on a quarterly basis or at least annually, just to ensure that, if their job roles have changed, that their roles to access or the system's access has changed as well in line with their job responsibilities. So that's in terms of identity and access management. Then we're looking at data protection. So there's quite a few items that they've indicated in the standard where you need to develop data loss prevention policies to ensure that, you've got monitoring, that there's encryption and other protective measures to ensure that data is secure throughout its life cycle. And you need to identify these technical measures in order to do that. You need to ensure that data is handled by third-party providers, are protected, and are given the same amount of security measures as within the financial institutions. With that also, you would also need to ensure that your agreements with these third-party providers, that you include the safe return, the transfer, the deletion of data upon the termination of services. And you should also include NDAs or confidential agreements so that with your third-party providers and with your employees as well, to ensure that your data is secure and that it's not going to get into the wrong hands. You also need to establish that only approved IT systems, devices, and storage medium should process and store, transmit, or retrieve sensitive data and implement controls to detect these. There are a few technology tools that I have put here. It's not considered tools that you have to implement according to the standard, but there are some tools that would assist you with ensuring compliance to the standard. And then data protection, there's still more things that you need to do in terms of that. So you need to establish processes to ensure sensitive data must only be used in non-production environments. So that's if you've got non-production environments, if you're doing or you're creating applications and you've got, your segregated environments in terms of your production, your testing, your development, ensure that there's no sensitive data on those non-production environments, because that the developers have access to that. The QA team might have access to that, and they shouldn't be having access to sensitive information. If you do need to give access to sensitive information, then that needs to get approval from the senior management, and that needs to be documented. So you need to make sure that there are controls to manage access and control this access to any sensitive data on your production environments and your non-production environments. Yeah, so that's basically it in terms of data protection. I'm not going to go through everything. There is quite a few there, but it's mainly to make sure that you're protecting your data and making sure that there are security measures in place where you identify the sensitive information and you make sure that there are, there's encryption, there's identity and access management in place, that it is restricted to the only authorized users in the environment. And then going on to cyber security awareness training. This is very important because you know what, your most important asset in your organization is your people, right? And you need to make sure that they know what the risk is for any cybersecurity attacks. So it's very important to mitigate this human factor risk. And as cyber attacks, they can exploit these human vulnerabilities, and training helps these organizations and these employees recognize and avoid these threats. And it reduces the likelihood of successful attacks that could compromise sensitive information. So these are just a bit of the, well, these are the requirements of the standard, where you need to develop an annual cybersecurity training program for all employees, as well as your governing body. They also need to obtain training in this regard. You need to conduct the training to all employees, incorporate phishing campaigns. So that's not an explicit requirement of the standard, and that's why it's not highlighted in blue. But phishing campaigns is very successful in terms of testing your employees to see that they are what they have actually learned in this training they can put into practice. So that's definitely something that you should consider. And then conducting refresher training annually. You know, there's always going to be changes in the environment. You know, for example, like the AI that comes into play, where you need to, you know, put specific policies for AI acceptable use, and then also roll that training out to them. They need to understand what they can and cannot do when using acceptable use, and what tools are approved. You know, there should be certain tools approved by the organization. They cannot, if the organization says that they can only use ChatGPT and they use Microsoft Copilot, there needs to be repercussions for that. So there should be policies and training on these policies for users. And then also undergo a regular review of this program. To make sure that it's still relevant. It includes, like I mentioned, AI and all the new or different emerging trends within the threat and risk landscape. And then just going on to the next slide. I know, Francois, you spoke about training in the previous few days. Is there anything you would like to add?
Thank you, Jane. Just testing if my sound is still good.
It's all good.
Yeah, so you know that part of the brain, I think it's called the amygdala. It's the part of the brain that deals with the flight, fight, freeze, and what I've added, flustered response. And it's only when we are confronted with a risk that we actually force our instinctive responses to kick in. And something I want to share here for the room, and I know especially the larger organizations, you'll have your training in place most likely and is running. But the classroom style, big sessions, I see that falling out of favor more and more. And what I am starting to see working is micro learning based training that people do in their own time, that you're in your own private space, very interestingly, that also has a positive impact on training, and where you're confronted with actual risks. So in a known training environment, something like a Know Before is a platform that we like. We recommend from time to time. And especially if you're a smaller organization and you'd like to meet certain best practice standards and training, this is certainly an example that we can point to. And of course, a platform that we've got a great relationship with. The interesting part that Jen mentioned as well a little bit earlier is the simulation or phishing attempts and so forth that are unknown to the user. And I mean, certainly internally in Cyberlogic, we are kept on our toes by the security team often by being confronted with these risks, and they're extremely well crafted and well put together. And there's a great sense of accountability when we do get our numbers for our different teams to see how they're doing. And you can imagine from our side, we take that quite seriously, doing what we do and advising clients on what we advise them. So that's a big theme for me here, Jen, is just the room has an awareness of the user must be confronted with the risk for training to be effective. Click engage in the training. Even on the know before videos, you're forced to actually click on like a sample phishing email, and then there will be questions. What does this email address look like? Is it suspicious? Must I reply? These sorts of things. And that's certainly a training best practice that I'm starting to see come up more and more, that I feel is important to share. Also, just touching on a question that came up in day one, I believe, was what are those security measures and standards? And before we continue, I was hoping just to tie it back, Jen, just a little bit. The content we've been going through for the Joint Standard 2, does it speak to that question that came up in the earlier sessions in terms of the measures and so forth? I'm just making sure we are covering some of the questions from earlier.
Yes, definitely. So what we have been going through is certain measures in terms of the identify, protect, detect section. So within those sections, there are different measures that they need to put in place. For example, the identity and access management, encryption of the data, also cybersecurity, that's a measure that they need to put in place as well. And then Roscoe will be taking us through the other measures that's applicable to the standard.
Thank you, Jen. Yeah, so as Jen mentioned, there are various other ones which I'll be going through, and I'll also be going through the next sections within Joint Standard 2 as well. Before I get there, I do want to address the question that was in the chat about the ransomware. And the question that was asked was, what is the view view on the payment of ransom where security has been compromised and the third party demands a ransom? So that just speaks to the importance of having these measures in place, right? Because the best practice is never to pay the ransom. There are risks of paying the ransom. So when you do pay a ransom, there's no guarantee you're going to get your data back, or the encryption key or the decryption key to decrypt them and get your data back. There's also no guarantee that they're not going to take that data and expose it to the internet. So you might be paying that ransom, but then still, get hit with all the bad parts about ransomware. So the best practice is really to have your measures in place so that you don't need to pay the ransom. Have your proper backups in place. Have your redundancy, and have those processes in place that you can deal with the ransomware incident or prevent it entirely from the start. Have your anti-malware programs in place, have your intrusion detection, and all of these other measures that you're speaking about here. That is why it is that important to have these, so that you are never in that situation where you have to pay a ransom. Unfortunately, if you do not have any of these measures in place, sometimes the only option you have is to pay that ransom and hope for the best. But we really do not ever want to be in that predicament. And then also another question that came through was on the AI acceptable use. So AI is, it's still relatively new. I think it's within the last 2 to 3 years, ChatGPT came out. So you can imagine how brand new this is within the industry, and how to manage that. It's still being considered in many ways by many standards and practices. And therefore, it is something that I can expect is still to come, but there is no direct, instruction on AI acceptable use. However, it is a subset of data governance. So you can imagine, your staff and employees are utilizing these AI technologies, such as ChatGPT, and they are putting certain information in there. And that information that gets utilized by these algorithms, and it learns from it. And sometimes you want to avoid that from happening, because you don't want your sensitive and confidential information being shared with these types of platforms to be learned from. So the best practice is, from a data governance perspective, making sure that that is a consideration when you are dealing with your policies and your data governance policies. hopefully that answers those two questions. If you have anything further to add, you can please pop it in the Q&A. So moving on to application and system security. So this is something that was briefly covered when we were speaking about the financial products and services and how to protect them. So with application and system security, that's really making sure that you are protecting your applications and your systems within your environment. So, these could be self-developed applications, or it could be any other applications that you are making use of that you have some control over. So you can, from the house perspective, you can think of this being a room in the house, that you go into to do a certain activity. Let's call it the kitchen. When you come into the kitchen, there's certain things you're going to be doing in the kitchen, and you want to make sure that that is done in a secure manner. So, are all the sharp knives packed away and out of reach of someone who shouldn't have access to them? So in the same way, you want to make sure that your applications are protected in a way that, if anyone had to access the application, that they can only do the things that they are meant to be doing. And this is why it's important to do things such as source code reviews and penetration testing to make sure that your application is actually secure and that any vulnerabilities or weaknesses in your application can be identified. If you think of the kitchen, example, can a child walk in there and access that sharp knife because it's sitting at a drawer that's at the bottom, and reachable to a child? That's obviously quite a risk, from a kitchen perspective. And similarly, from an application perspective, can people only access what they need to, or can they exploit something to get access to something? And you can discover this through doing reviews of the source code, as well as hiring a certified and skilled penetration tester to assess that. Then what's also important is to implement secure dev operations. So as part of a DevSecOps, so development security operations lifecycle of developing your applications, it is important to introduce security into that lifecycle. And what this means is that with every change that is implemented to your applications and systems, that those changes are tested from a security perspective before they are able to go into production. So if you think of maybe you're a developer of a banking application, and you have a banking application that your clients make use of, or your customers make use of. Before you implement any and push any change to that banking application, even if it's a new feature, it needs to go through rigorous security testing first to make sure that you're not opening up any holes. So if you think about the kitchen, to make sure that no one's moving the knives from the top drawer to the bottom, so that they are accessible to someone who could be at risk. Then from a network security perspective, this is really the networking side of things. So you have your applications which are being housed within a network. So if you think about the house, you have your kitchen, but there are certain passages that lead to the kitchen, and which allow for the movement of things from, you've just made a very nice meal, but you're going to eat it in the dining room. You're now taking that meal from the kitchen into the dining room. But, has that meal been transferred securely? On the way to the dining room, has it been poisoned? Making sure that it is seen and that whatever data is flowing within this network, that it is actually secure, it hasn't been tampered with, and that there's no one who is watching and prying on this network that shouldn't be. So this is why developing security standards within your network is very important, and also from a security in-depth approach. So making sure that on all layers of your network, things are protected. And this can be achieved by, implementing firewalls and intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems. So the firewall, would act as that security guard, or that bouncer that is sitting in front of your house saying, are you actually allowed to be in here? Should I allow you in? Are you going to be conducting, suitable and approved activities? Then the IDS and the IPS is to detect if someone made its way in, that shouldn't be in there. So IDS, like I mentioned, stands for intrusion detection system, and IPS stands for intrusion prevention. Detection is really just alerting and monitoring, and prevention is taking automatic action to stop something. So you can think about this in the way that there's some malicious person within your house, right? Think about those spy movies where, someone dresses up and they're acting as if they are part of the catering team, but they're actually somebody malicious trying to get to somebody important. So your IDS and your IPS is very important to detect if there are any actors or threat actors or weird behavior happening on this network, to make sure that it is flagged and it is dealt with appropriately. But as you know, security changes, threat landscape changes. I'm sure if you watch the first Mission Impossible movie, you would see that the measures that Tom Cruise used to get into certain places are very different to now. I think back then there was no incorporation of AI in the glasses. Maybe the glasses could just see through walls, but now the glasses can detect all of these special things. So with all the changes and technology changes within the threat landscape itself, it is also very important to make sure that all of your security controls are always reviewed and up to date and effective, given your environment and the changes that happen within it. So that is why it is mandated to always review the security controls that you have implemented. And then the last part of the network security side is that network segregation. So, if you think about within the house, you maybe you have a double story and there are rooms at the back, bedrooms at the back, and then when you go up the stairs, maybe at the bottom of the stairs is where your public areas are. Maybe it's your dining room and your public bathroom and things. So when someone goes upstairs, that their purpose is really to get to the bathroom or private areas. If you think about also taking it back to some movies where you can see someone is venturing to areas where they shouldn't be, and then someone catches them and it's like, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be here. So it's the same thing with your network segregation, where you would have certain areas on one side on a certain network and other more private areas on another network, so that when you identify that someone is on the network that they actually shouldn't be, maybe this network has certain servers on it, and when someone is there, you can identify, hey, you're not supposed to get access to these servers. What are you doing on this network? And it can trigger alarm bells. Whereas if those private servers were on the guest network, it will be very difficult to determine if that person is meant to be here or not. So that is why network segregation is very important. And also you can put measures in place which, if someone does get access to a less sensitive network, it'll be very difficult for them to jump from that network to the other network. So having that network segregation really makes it a lot more secure, and allows for networks to have a specific purpose, which, like I mentioned, helps with detection. The next area is cryptography. So this is really making sure that your data and your network activity and everything is encrypted and is kept secret. So the best way I can describe this from an analogy point of view is having a secret language when you enter your house. If you think about Morse code, when you tap and communicate that way, it's a form of secret communication. So if someone comes in and they don't understand Morse code, they won't be able to understand that communication. So even if someone is malicious, they made their way into your organization or into your house, they won't understand what's going on. So the data is basically useless to them. However, a big part of cryptography is having that keys that can actually decrypt that communication. So making sure that those are all kept private and safe and secure is extremely important. So if you think about Morse code, if someone gets the instruction to see that 3 quick taps equals a certain letter as an example, or a number, they can easily then decrypt all the communication and understand all the communication happening that's using Morse code. So it is very important that firstly you do have a secret language. So you do have your data encrypted so that if it gets accessed by someone, that they won't be able to understand what the data is saying, but also that the keys to decrypt that data is kept secure. Just waiting for the slides to change. Okay, so that closes off protection, and now onto detection. So this is really mandating that organizations have appropriate capabilities in monitoring IT systems and access to detect incidents. So, really making sure that you can evaluate controls through audits and testing and understand from a log perspective that you are keeping the appropriate logs that can be correlated to certain potential events. So if you think of the house analogy, this is really your cameras and alarms. From a camera perspective, it is constantly monitoring, but it also needs to be recording. So if an incident does occur, you can go back on those recordings and you can, review it and see what actually happened. Also, modern cameras can alert you when they see movement, which is important. So from an IT security side, if there is any type of anomalous behavior, that it does get alerted to the appropriate teams. And then also from a security perspective, just if you think about your CCTV again, if someone, breaks into your house and you have CCTV and they get access to that device, which is your CCTV hard drive, and they take it, then unfortunately you would have no access to that evidence anymore. So that's why also from an IT security perspective, making sure that your logs are protected, that it's being stored securely, that it's inaccessible and cannot be changed by someone who is malicious. That is extremely important. Tying it back to the movies again, sometimes you'll see that the security guard was paid off and they were told to delete certain footage from the security cameras. As well, from an insider threat perspective, it is also very important that your logs and all of these, audit logs and tracking measures are protected even from an inside perspective, so that they are immutable, that they can't be changed by anybody, and that is being stored securely. So you can see that log management is extremely important, and that is what I was touching base on, making sure that all of your logs, your tracking of activities, tracking of behavior, all of this is managed securely and is not able to be changed by anybody, even administrators. So what you tend to do is you will have logs coming in, stored on a certain system, but then it will be pushed to another system, which is housed somewhere else that is protected. So in the case you need to go review logs, there's an incident, you need to do forensics, there are secure logs that can be investigated. Also to consider log retention and how long you're going to keep certain logs for. Obviously, the more logs you keep, the bigger the size and possibly the more expensive. But it is important to ensure that you have the right means to investigate something if there is an issue. And one important aspect of log management is that it's not expected that you record absolutely everything. Like I mentioned, if you record everything, it will add to your costs because of the size of certain logs. But the important thing is to identify what are the key logs you want to record, and think of the case of an incident. Would you want to understand the person's name or the device name that was used to be malicious, or the username or the IP address? Any of those aspects, it is very important to understand what you want to keep and from what systems you want to keep it. So do you want to get this from the firewall, from the intrusion detection system, from your email server? It is very important to note which logs you want to keep, and then make sure that they are appropriate and that they are immutable and stored securely. And then the other section is just like I said, set up your continuous monitoring and alert protocols. So make sure that when you detect something that is anomalous, that it does get alerted to the appropriate parties that are going to handle that. So if you think about the CCTV again, I know with modern cameras, you can set it up in a way that if it detects an animal, it won't alert you, but when it detects a person, it will alert you. Similarly, with the IT space, if it detects certain behavior that is deemed to be normal, it won't necessarily alert you. And when it detects something that's anomalous, that will. And new technology and AI really does assist this, because it does continuous learning to understand behaviors. And when it sees that deviation, it then raises alarm bells. So yeah, that kind of log management and continuous monitoring and alerting is extremely important. Another note that I need to add is that it is important that those alerts are actually actioned by a team. So a lot of the time, this is a security operations center, because if if these alerts are being triggered and no one's looking at it, it really defeats the purpose of having these alarms in the first place, right? It's like having an alarm, which could be a silent alarm in your house, but it's not going anywhere and no one's monitoring it, so no action has been taken. Then it kind of makes the alarm pointless. So having a team behind monitoring these alerts and actioning it is extremely important, and making sure that it is set up in a way that it doesn't also create alert fatigue. So when I mentioned raising an alarm for seeing a dog or animal versus a human, it's important to make sure that you're only raising alerts for anomalous behavior, or otherwise the team's going to be flooded with thousands of alerts, which could be just normal behavior. So it is important to manage that appropriately. Okay, moving on to response and recovery. So response and recovery mandates that financial institutions ensure robust response and recovery measures, such as rapid incident response, which I was speaking a little bit about from a security operations center, making sure that you have secure data backups, or defined recovery objectives and clear communication strategies. So if I tie this back to the house, this is planning how you're going to deal with something like a burglary, right? What are the steps you're going to take when someone does attempt to break into your house or successfully break into your house? So making sure if there's a robbery, making sure that you can have certain plans for redundancy, that you can still make use of your house in that case, and that you can alert certain people that might have been affected by this robbery. You can imagine you live in a community, like a complex, and if your house gets broken into, you want to alert your groups to, because it definitely affects them, that someone is within the property as well. So making sure that you have certain plans to approach that rapidly is very important. Having police on call and all of those types of items. So the main item is really to create that incident response plan. This is not to be confused with the normal, IT incident and problem management. This is specifically for security incidents. And what I mean by that is, from a security incident perspective, it really affects your cybersecurity, whereas other kind of IT issues and problem management could just be, someone can't log into their device because they forgot their password. Whereas this is something like there is an actual attack, your data is at risk, your operations are at risk, and it's done by a malicious entity, whether that is an insider or an external party. So having a response plan developed to account for all of those different scenarios are important. In your response plan, you're going to go through, what are your preventative measures? So being proactive about what kind of controls you have in place to prevent these things from taking place in the first place, having your detection measures, having your, your response to that. And within your plan, you're also going to have playbooks which outline how you would approach different types of scenarios. And also following that to identify whether you have to communicate to customers or not, and who you have to communicate with, and who is going to communicate, and who are the different people who will be taking ownership of doing the investigation, who's going to take in ownership of just assessing the entirety of the incident. And there are many different players involved. Like you can see on the left hand side, under people, you have your cybersecurity incident response team, you have your IT support, you have senior management. So there are many different players, and that is all outlined within your incident response plan. Also important to include are the contact details of different people, because in an incident you want to have a nice laid out plan, and you don't want to be hunting around for contact information, hunting around to understand what your next step should be. You want to have it all laid out in an easy to follow plan. And that is why having a robust incident response plan is extremely important. Then it's also important to create disaster recovery plans. So, in the case of something happening, it might not be a cybersecurity incident, but it might be, a disaster. Maybe there was an earthquake and it damaged some of your servers. You would need to be able to have a plan to recover from that within a certain time frame. And then additionally, on top of that, your business continuity plans are important. So how do you continue business operations if a disaster had to strike, if there was a cybersecurity incident? How do you make sure that from a business perspective, you are still continuing? And this can expand outside of IT as well, because there could be other measures that you can utilize outside of IT that can still keep business operations going, and then have a plan to integrate that back into IT once things are up and running again. So having all of these plans are extremely important as part of your organization, but equally important is to do simulated exercises and update plans accordingly based on that simulation outcomes. So having a plan in place is one thing, but being able to test it and ensure that the plan is rigorous, and with any changes that happen within your organization, that everything is being adjusted and accounted for. I think that is extremely important and is mandated by the standard to ensure that you are doing these types of simulations. And I would recommend you do that at least on an annual basis. Then testing and assurance. So this, that testing from your plans is a nice segue into testing overall from a cybersecurity perspective. So this is just really making sure that from an overall cybersecurity perspective, across all of your IT controls, that those are rigorously tested to make sure that they are meeting its purpose. So if you think of the house, it's like getting someone to inspect that your house and your security measures are in place, is secure. You can even, ask someone to try and break in and see if they can get through, to try and identify what the weaknesses are. And you'll do that by a trusted party instead of, waiting for the case that someone who actually wants to be malicious against your house or your organization takes that action. So that's why testing is important. And I know this was briefly covered before, but it is really something that is quite important. So conducting effective controls testing, making sure that from a vulnerability management perspective, that is being done and is being done across your entire IT landscape. Vulnerability management is essentially automated scans which scan and they detect known vulnerabilities. So that can alert you on any weaknesses across your IT systems. Then it is also important to do penetration tests. So penetration tests are the more manual approach. So it's essentially making use of not just an automated scan, but also using human intellect to piece things together and to identify certain weaknesses. So it is a lot more mature than vulnerability assessments. However, vulnerability assessments being automated can cover a wider range in a quicker time. So what is important is to do both vulnerability assessments as well as penetration tests to understand where your weaknesses are across your IT systems. And this is obviously a mandated measure that needs to be put in place from the standards perspective. Then, or importantly, it doesn't make any sense to just identify issues and do nothing about them. It is important to always remediate your findings that come from these assessments and these tests, and also to track that remediation. So you identify what the weaknesses are, you track that as part of that remediation journey so that you can identify, okay, fine, this has been remediated now. So when you do testing again, it should be remediated. You do things like retesting. So often as part of your penetration testing cycle, you'll do a penetration test, you will get the team who will remediate those weaknesses identified. And then you'll get the penetration testers in again to just retest that same issue to make sure that it was appropriately remediated. And then what you'll do is you will continuously improve these policies and plans based on lessons learned. So let's say, for example, you deployed vulnerability management, it's going, and then when you get the report, you see that, oh, there was a server that wasn't included, or there was a certain way of scanning that wasn't included. Maybe just scanning a network and not your web applications as an example, then you need to improve that policy and plan to make sure that it does cover all the necessary items that it needs to. I'll just move on to the next slide. Francis, if you don't mind, if you can move on to the next slide.
Oscar, I think maybe perhaps you can just flick through on your end.
It's not working.
Oh, I see.
Sorry about this, just some technical difficulties. In the meantime, you can pop questions that you might have into the Q&A. Priyanka, just to confirm, can you see a slide presentation or not?
Well, I'll share it on my side. Just give me a sec.
Perfect.
Maybe just do a bit of maybe what you think about the last section you covered in the meantime, Oscar.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone has any questions, please pop them in chat. I hope that you are able to follow and that my analogies are helpful, because I do understand that, cybersecurity is quite a difficult concept for many people. So it is, yeah, I do try my best to make it a little bit relatable, but yeah, IT controls and security can become quite tricky. Perfect, thank you. I hope you can all see the screen again. So onto situational awareness. The situational awareness mandates that financial institutions maintain situational awareness by continuously understanding the threat landscape and assessing their cyber risk mitigation measures. So if I tie it back to the house analogy, this is really just making sure that you understand, what the new developments are within, risks surrounding your property. If you think way back, there was a time when burglar bars was not a thing, right? And then all of a sudden, criminals started breaking into homes via the windows, and then burglar bars got introduced as a control, to try and prevent that. So in the same way, we need to be kept up to date with understanding what is going on in the digital realm. What are the new threats that's coming into play? We can move on to the OPPT table. Yeah, so this is really the mandate to establish procedures to collect and share, both from an internal and external source perspective, to understand what is going on, within the threat landscape of IT security. And this can include setting up formal arrangements for exchange and actionable threat intelligence with trusted external partners. So I know there are forums, such as forums for CISOs, so Chief Information Security Officers, where they can all come together in a trusted manner and share lessons learned from their organizations, so that they can help improve controls within the other people's organizations without them having to go through the same thing. So think about it as case studies, alerting that this type of thing is happening. Please make sure that you protect yourself from this. So having that, both the contribution and also the ingestion of these communities can be extremely beneficial to help preventing risk. So so conducting periodic reviews on how you go about this threat intelligence is important, making sure that you are within the right communities, you are exchanging the right information, and that it is only with trusted parties that is extremely important from this point of view. Okay, you can move on to the next slide. So this is just an example on a guide to threat information sharing. So this is published by NIST. So we will be sharing links to these. So if you do want some guidance, you can read through this and get some guidance on how you can approach that. Then on to learning and evolving. So just like was mentioned about the threat intelligence, making sure that you are learning and evolving your security strategy are equally as important. So you're getting this information and you're now evolving. So as an example with the burglar bar thing, when you are understanding that many people are facing break-ins through their windows, and this burglar bar is a new measure you can put in place, actually updating your security and implementing that burglar bars is the right move to making sure that you are addressing that risk. Move on to the next slide. So what is important from this perspective is to conduct post-incident reviews. So for example, if unfortunately there is an incident that took place in your organization, it is important to do a post-incident review. So understand, what took place, what the gaps were, and then addressing that, as part of lessons learned sessions, where you can go through the incident, understand what the gaps were, and then discussing and implementing solutions to fill those gaps. And then you will then update the policies based on that feedback. So you'll update your incident response plan, you'll update your, all of your security policies to make sure that you do then address that gap that was, that enabled that incident. And that is a continuous cycle. So you are continuously taking this information, you're continuously holding lessons learned from your institution's incidents. You're, like we were speaking about, the situational awareness, taking lessons learned from other organizations and taking it all in, understanding the threat landscape, and then constantly evolving your cybersecurity strategy to make sure that it does address the latest and greatest. We were speaking about AI, and the question was appropriately raised about AI measures. Are there any mandates? And that's something that is going to then feed back into the standards, and it's going to be updated. And that's why the risk landscape always needs to be understood constantly. With its being an evolving risk landscape, it needs to constantly be understood, and then protective measures put in place to address those new risks that might come about. Then on to cybersecurity hygiene practices. So, like securing a home, really making sure that you have your appropriate locks, alarms, defenses, access control. All of those are these different measures. And what we're going to do now is go through a list of these things, which can be, come across as quite repetitive, but it's really just, putting down what are those measures that are really great and mandated cybersecurity hygiene practices. Can you move on to the next slide? Yeah. So from an access management perspective, you really want to make sure that you are implementing and periodically reviewing your access control policies and conducting access reviews. So like was mentioned before, when Genevieve touched base on access management, you will have these controls which enable access management, but it's also very important to do reviews to understand if those controls were circumvented and if they are actually doing what they're meant to be doing. You can also think of a situation where you have a certain system in place and person A, let's call him Charlie, was meant to have access to the system at that point in time. So he, from a controls perspective, he got through all the controls because he was authenticated. But then Charlie left the organization, and Charlie shouldn't have any more access to this. But then because he didn't have a process in place to remove Charlie, there's a risk that Charlie can then still access the system. So doing that review to understand, who is allowed to access and validating that is equally as important as having the controls in place. And that's also just another control, which are reviews, user access reviews that needs to be implemented to understand if it is still meeting the requirements. Then from a privilege access management perspective, making sure that only like from a privilege access perspective, that is only accessed by the right people. So just because someone has access to a certain platform does not mean they should have privileged access to that platform, which could mean administrative access. So defining and enforcing privileged access procedures are very important, making sure that you can only allow privileged access to certain people, and like I said, having that reviewed, and also having the activity reviewed via logs is important to understand if any malicious activity is taking place. Then having things such as multi-factor authentication is important. So multi-factor authentication is just another, it adds to your authentication method to make sure that there are two factors instead of just one. So if you think in the past, all you needed is a password to access a certain system, but as you know, passwords can be easily compromised. So what we have done is obviously added MFA, which is a multi-factor. So instead of just having your password, you have to validate that or verify that it is you using another method, such as an authenticator app or an SMS, or even biometrics like a fingerprint in certain cases. So having that multi-factor is important, because if one of those factors are compromised, you at least have the other factor that is protecting you. So yeah, MFA is extremely important in today's time to make sure that it is rolled out across all of your systems. If a system doesn't allow for MFA to be enabled, there are some legacy systems which don't have multi-factor authentication capabilities. It is extremely important to then implement compensating controls, which will cover that in another way. Then from a network perimeter defense, making sure that, like we were mentioning, your network security is in place, that you have firewalls and your firewall rules, that you have your network segregation. So that's just really just making sure that you have your network security and your network perimeter defended against unauthorized activity or attackers. Then your vulnerability and patch management. So as I mentioned before, conducting vulnerability scans are important, but also executing those patches to fix those issues which are raised are equally as important. That is what I was talking about when it comes to that remediation cycle. So tracking the vulnerabilities, making sure they are actually addressed is extremely important. Then secure configurations. So it is extremely important to develop secure configuration standards, or even make use of the vendor's recommended best practices. So this is your configuration of your platform itself. So if you make use of something like, Microsoft 365, by default, Microsoft doesn't configure that to be the most secure configuration, because, certain security configuration can affect operations, and they don't want to make any assumptions that this is the way that you operate. So they leave it up to you to make sure that you configure it securely, to your standards and your operational, which will meet your operational requirements. So making sure that all of your systems have these secure configurations defined and applied is extremely important from that perspective, to make sure that security is in check and best practices are applied. Then you also want to make sure that you do regular configuration audits. So for example, you might have printers in your organization and it's set up securely, because you've just done you've implemented your secure configuration standards, and now we're going to apply these configuration standards to your printers. All great. In a year's time, you get a new printer that comes in, and that was just deployed, and no one applied that secure configuration to it. Therefore, that printer could be a gateway into your network. So it is extremely important to then do those regular audits, so that you can identify any of those outliers that might have misprocessed or got through due to some other reason. Then onto malware protection. So as you know, there are things called malware, which is malicious software, basically viruses, which can come in all shapes and forms. And it is extremely important to make sure that you have tools and technologies in place which can identify these this malware and also prevent it from being deployed within your organization from the start. So unfortunately, you know, attackers are very smart and they always constantly trying to disguise their malware to look like something that is authorized and official. And therefore, it's important to keep your software, which is your anti-malware software, up to date, because what the platform engineers are doing on their side is constantly researching, looking for what the latest malware is and updating their software to be able to detect that malware. So that's why it is extremely important to make sure that all of your anti-malware software is up to date, that it is regularly scanning all of your IT systems, and that it is alerting. And you can see there's an item that says monitor alerts, which says that it is important to also be constantly monitoring and alerting, and then having your security operations center actually addressing those alerts as well. We'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so we have already covered notification and regulatory reporting. Marie covered it, so I'm not going to go over that again, but it's just reiterating that all of these security controls, you know, all of these things, and if there are incidents that it is, you know, that the appropriate parties are notified, whether that be customers or the regulator, it is just important to make sure that you have the processes in place that can appropriately notify and report. Thank you. That was me. I'll hand back over to Francois.
Thank you very much, and certainly hope that you got a very good first-hand account of the different cybersecurity focus areas from an expert on the front line with his team, and that it was practical and useful. I always think we assume these measures are implemented well, but are they implemented against the appropriate standard and the evolving risks that are out there in the market? Vilmarie and Priyanka, I'd invite you to help us wrap up the 3 days before we announce the winner of the prize. So if you're on, please don't drop yet. We will be announcing that winner shortly. I'll go to Priyanka first.
Yeah, I think actually can Vilmarie go first so we can go from day one sequentially, Francois.
Certainly.
Thanks, Francois. So I think and hopefully we've helped all of you to break down the joint standards 1 and 2 a little bit and provided some practical guidance on it. I think all 3 days were quite information dense. Day 1 we went through the foundation phases, the IT strategy, our IT governance, our IT operations, and hopefully set out the scene there. Going forward, if there's any questions, if there's any ways in which we can make that more simpler or break it down, we obviously happy to assist. You will get the slides, you will get the LPPT table in a separate document, so in a consolidated document where it's easy to use, so you don't have to go scratch around in the slides. So you will get that as well, and you will get some templates as well after today's session. Priyanka, anything you want to add on day 2?
Yes, yeah, thanks, Vilmarie. I think a big focus for us on day 2, which was yesterday, feels like last week, was just really trying to bring in how a lot of these sections overlap with our privacy frameworks, which is a very helpful thing for those companies that have already done so much work under POPI as well, and how to really just leverage that compliance, adapt and tweak it a little bit, just to get you there for your data handling practices under the joint standard. And also what was interesting was looking at just financial products and thinking about how do you actually manage the IT risks there, and it would obviously depend on the kind of financial products you have on your systems, whether it's something that's been internally developed or something that you're working with a third party to help you with. And then we also looked a lot at one of Francois' favorite topics, which is IT project management and program management, and practically what that looks like. And wrapping up yesterday, we looked at BC and DR, or business continuity and disaster recovery, and also just talking about how that also interweaves with your outsourcing requirements at the SOB and the PA and the FSCA has issued in respect of banks and insurers as well. So lots of things that perhaps already are in place, but that you can just take an extra step or enhance just to get you there through the gaps in the joint standard. And then on day 3, we heard a lot from Roscoe and Jen. We really wanted to spend a lot of time dealing with the joint standard 2 of 24, which comes out in 2 months' time. In June. It's very, very technical heavy, and I'm so glad we were able to get Roscoe and Jen to speak to those technical issues, and we hope that emphasis that they placed on the cybersecurity joint standard was helpful to you. And then obviously just when Wilmer and I, at the beginning of the session, we did speak a lot about the IT assurance and what that means and what independence means and notification and reporting and how this can be practically managed across your frameworks and not just the joint standards. Thanks, Francois.
Francois, are your sound back, or shall we continue with the prize
Yes.
and announce that and how that worked? Okay, I'm not sure if Francois, so
Sure, Vilmarie, you can go ahead.
Okay.
So we had I think we announced it on day 1 that there will be a random draw. So we did a random draw based on the companies that attended. I think who's controlling the slides, we have a winner based on that random draw. So congratulations to Battlear Capital. You are the winner of our combined prize. So you are getting a vulnerability scan by Cyberlogic, valued at 10,000 Rand. And also from ENS, you get a training session for limited amount of attendees. It's valued at 25,000 Rand. And you have a choice of topics. So you can choose between training on how to prepare for POPI audits. We know that the regulator is going around and doing actual audits at companies, and so getting training on how to deal with that and how does that look. Or vendor assurance. So how do you vet your vendors? We spoke a lot about that in the last few days, but how do you actually vet your vendors? How does vendor questionnaires look and vendor contracting? Another option is reporting on cyber incidents or assistance with breach incident handling, and then responsible AI. So training on and how do we deal with AI. So not all 4, but a selection of one of them. We'll be in touch with you afterwards to set up a time that is convenient to you. I think that wraps up not only day 3, but the session we had over the last 3 days. I think we have some more time left. If there is any more questions that you want to ask in the last few minutes, please pop that into the Q&A. If not, I just want to really thank all the panelists, the Cyberlogic team, Hyperclear Group, my colleague Priyanka. Francois, thank you for coordinating over the last 3 days. It's really been great presenting with all of you. To all of our attendings, thank you for sticking with us through the 3 days. I know it's been a lot of talking, a lot of information. We really appreciate your interaction and questions. It always makes it a lot easier if there's interaction from the audience. So thank you very much for all of you attending as well. Thanks. I don't see any further questions. So I think then that's a wrap from us. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.